Working as a waitress on a cruise, the woman froze upon realizing that the millionaire was her husband who died 7 years ago. She approached and Sarah had never felt happier. The news of her pregnancy had turned her quiet life upside down in the best way possible. Twins. She and Michael had always talked about having a family. But this was beyond what they'd ever dreamed. Sitting in their cozy living room, Sarah watched Michael's eyes light up as she told him the news. His face was a mixture of disbelief and pure joy. "Twins?" he had asked, his voice cracking with emotion as he ran a hand through his thick, dark hair. "We're having twins?" She nodded, smiling so widely that her cheeks hurt. "Yeah, can you believe it?" Michael pulled her into a tight embrace, his breath shaky with excitement. "I can't believe this, Sarah. This is everything." Everything. It felt like they were on top of the world. Their small, simple life felt perfect. They lived in a modest home in the suburbs. Nothing fancy, but it was theirs. They both worked hard, and even though they didn't have much, they had each other. And now, they had the future they had always dreamed of, a family. For the next week, they were wrapped up in baby names, nursery designs, and planning their new life. Michael joked about learning to change 2 diapers at once, while Sarah made lists of baby clothes and essentials. They had no idea how they were going to afford it all, but that didn't matter. They were happy. And then, just as quickly as the joy had come, it was snatched away. The call came late in the evening, when the sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the living room. Michael had been out running an errand, picking up some things for dinner, and Sarah had stayed home, her hand absently resting on her still flat belly. She had been thinking about the future, imagining the twins running around their yard, when the phone rang. It was strange. Michael should have been home by now. "Hello?" she answered, her voice calm, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. "Mrs. Thompson?" The voice on the other end was official, detached. "Yes, this is she. Who's calling?" "I'm calling about your husband, Michael Thompson." There was a pause, just long enough for Sarah's heart to drop. "There's been an accident." The words didn't make sense at first. Accident? Michael? Her mind couldn't connect the dots. He had just been out getting groceries. How could there have been an accident? But the voice continued, filling the silence with details she didn't want to hear. "His car went off the road. We've searched the area, but we haven't been able to recover his body." For a moment, everything stopped. The room seemed to close in on her, and her breath caught in her throat. No, this wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. I don't understand," Sarah stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean you can't find him?" The voice softened slightly, but the words were no less brutal. "We believe the current may have taken the car into the river. It's likely the body was swept away." Sarah's knees buckled. She sank to the floor, clutching the phone as if it were her only lifeline. Michael, gone, just like that. Her mind screamed that it couldn't be true, that there had to be a mistake. But the official, somber tone on the other end told her otherwise. The days that followed were a blur. There was no closure, no body to bury. Nothing to confirm what had happened beyond the words of strangers and the empty space in her life where Michael used to be. Friends and family tried to comfort her, but there were no words that could fill the void. He was gone, and all that remained was the suffocating silence of their once joyful home. And then, just when Sarah thought things couldn't get worse, they did. It started with a knock at the door. She opened it to find a man she didn't recognize, his expression stern and impatient. "Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, though it was clear he already knew the answer. "Yes?" "I'm here to collect the debt your husband owed." "Debt?" Sarah frowned. "I don't understand. What debt?" The man's lips twisted into a thin, humorless smile. "Your husband owed a substantial amount of money to some, let's say, less forgiving lenders, and now, since he's no longer around to pay it, that responsibility falls to you. Her blood ran cold. Michael had never mentioned any debts. They weren't rich, but they had always made do. How could this be possible? "I don't have any money," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The man's smile didn't waver. "That's not my problem. You'll find a way, or else." And with that, he turned and left, leaving Sarah standing in the doorway, stunned and terrified. The weight of the world seemed to crush her from all sides. She was pregnant, alone, and now burdened with a debt she had no way of paying. The life she and Michael had dreamed of together was gone, replaced by a nightmare she couldn't escape. As the days dragged on, Sarah tried to stay strong for the sake of her unborn children. But with each passing moment, the reality of her situation became harder to ignore. She was alone, and the world was closing in on her. In the months that followed, Sarah's life became a relentless cycle of fear and exhaustion. The joy she once felt at the thought of becoming a mother was clouded by the crushing weight of the debt Michael had left behind. She had no idea how deep he'd been in, and now, with every passing week, it became painfully clear that she was in way over her head. The phone calls started first, anonymous, cold voices reminding her of the money she owed. Every time the phone rang, her heart would race, panic seizing her until she mustered the courage to answer. Each conversation was the same, threatening, impatient demands for payments she couldn't make. Sarah tried to explain, again and again, that she didn't have the money. "I'm pregnant," she'd say, hoping for some shred of compassion. "My husband is gone, and I'm doing my best." But her words fell on deaf ears. To them, she was just another debtor, another name on a list. And every time she hung up, her situation felt even more impossible. The pressure from the Agiotas was relentless. When the calls didn't scare her enough, they escalated. Men started showing up at her door unannounced. She'd open it cautiously, only to be met with cold stares and blunt reminders of the debt. Their presence was suffocating, as if they were waiting for her to crack. "You have a month," one of them told her after handing her a slip of paper. "I get the money, or we'll make sure you pay another way." Sarah stared at the paper in disbelief. The amount owed was far more than she could ever imagine. It felt like drowning in an ocean with no way out, each wave higher and more merciless than the last. Every time she thought she could catch her breath, the reality of her financial situation hit her harder. Desperate, she took any job she could find. She cleaned houses, worked late nights at local diners, and even did odd jobs for neighbors, all while trying to hide her growing belly. She couldn't afford to slow down, not with the constant threats looming over her. But her body, exhausted and worn, had other plans. One night, as she was scrubbing floors at a small local shop, her vision blurred. She tried to shake it off, but the world around her began to spin. She felt herself sway and grabbed onto the counter to steady herself, but it was no use. The last thing she remembered was the cold tile floor rushing up to meet her before everything went black. When Sarah came to, she was lying in a hospital bed, a nurse checking her vitals. Her heart raced with panic as her hands instinctively went to her belly. The nurse, noticing her distress, placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Your babies are fine," she said softly. "But you're pushing yourself too hard. You need to rest." Rest? The word felt like a cruel joke. How could she rest when her entire life was falling apart? But the nurse's words echoed in her mind. Sarah knew she had to be careful. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her children. With no other choice, Sarah cut back on her hours, which only made things worse. The bills piled up faster than she could pay them, and the threats from the Agiotas grew more intense. She tried selling what little she had of value, but it barely made a dent. Every penny she earned seemed to disappear into the void of debt, leaving her with nothing. The stress became unbearable. There were nights when she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she would survive another day. Her mind raced with dark thoughts, doubts creeping in like shadows in the night. She felt trapped, like she was suffocating under the weight of her situation. But every time she thought about giving up, she remembered her babies. They were all she had left of Michael, and even though he had left her with this mess, she couldn't abandon them. They were her light in the darkness, the only reason she kept going. By the time her twins were born, Sarah was running on fumes. She held them in her arms, their tiny fingers gripping hers, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself a moment of peace. In that hospital room, surrounded by silence, she made a vow. No matter what, she would protect them. She would find a way to survive, even if it meant sacrificing every last part of herself. But reality waited for her outside those hospital doors. The world hadn't changed while she was in the hospital. The agiotas were still there, waiting for their payment. And now, with 2 mouths to feed, Sarah's situation was even more dire. The fear, once a low hum in the background, became a constant roar in her ears. Weeks turned into months, and Sarah's life continued in a blur of sleepless nights and grueling workdays. Her twins, now crawling and giggling, were the only bright spots in her otherwise bleak existence. But every smile, every laugh, was tinged with the ever-present threat hanging over their heads. It wasn't until one particularly bad day, when the phone rang yet again with another demand for payment, that Sarah realized something had to change. She couldn't keep going like this, living in fear, waiting for the next knock at the door. She needed a way out. And when the opportunity finally came, it wasn't in the form of a lifeline, but rather a chance to board a luxury cruise, a job that, while difficult, promised just enough money to pay off the debt that had haunted her for years. It was her only option, and without hesitation, she took it. 7 years had passed, but the weight on Sarah's shoulders hadn't eased. If anything, it had grown heavier. The twins, Jacob and Lily, were now 7 years old, bright-eyed and full of life, completely unaware of the danger that always seemed to lurk in the background. Sarah had done her best to shield them from the harsh reality of their situation, but every day felt like a battle she wasn't sure she could win. Despite working tirelessly at multiple jobs, Sarah had barely made a dent in the debt. The agiotas were as relentless as ever, showing up at her door or calling her whenever she fell behind on a payment, which seemed to happen more often than not. The threats grew darker, their patience running thin. There were moments when she feared for her life, and worse, for the safety of her children. Sarah knew she couldn't continue living like this. She was worn down, her body exhausted from years of overwork, and the constant fear was starting to take its toll on her mind. The children noticed the bags under her eyes, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes anymore, but she couldn't let them know the truth. As far as they were concerned, their mom was strong, always holding everything together, even when it felt like her world was falling apart. One evening, after a long shift at the diner, Sarah sat in her cramped apartment, going over the bills scattered across the table. Her hands trembled as she stared at the numbers that didn't add up. She had enough for rent, but that was it. There would be no money left for food, let alone the next payment to the agiotas. A knock at the door startled her. She knew who it was before she even answered. Her heart raced, fear coiling in her chest as she opened the door a crack. It was one of the men who worked for the agiotas, a hulking figure with cold eyes that never softened, no matter how much she begged for more time. He was the face she had come to dread, a reminder that the clock was ticking. "You're late again?" he said, his voice flat, as if they were discussing something as mundane as the weather. "I just need a little more time," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I swear, I'll have the money soon." The man's expression didn't change. "You've been saying that for years, Sarah. The boss is getting tired of waiting." Sarah's throat tightened. She knew what that meant. She had heard stories of people who crossed these men, people who were never seen again. She had always managed to scrape by, always found a way to make just enough to keep them at bay. But she was running out of options. "I have a job lined up," she said quickly, hoping to buy herself more time. "I'm starting in a few days. It's a good one. I'll be able to pay off everything, I promise." The man raised an eyebrow, finally showing a hint of interest. A job? Doing what? Sarah swallowed, her palms sweaty. It's on a cruise ship, a luxury cruise. I'll be working as a waitress. For the first time, the man seemed to consider her words. A cruise, huh? That could work, but you better make sure it does, or we'll come collecting, and it won't just be money we take. The implication hung heavy in the air. Sarah nodded quickly, her pulse pounding in her ears. She watched as the man turned and left, her entire body trembling once the door clicked shut. The relief was temporary, but it was enough. The job on the cruise had been her lifeline, the only chance she had to get out from under this crushing debt. If she could save up enough during her time at sea, she could finally put an end to this nightmare. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Sarah arranged for her neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Reynolds, to watch the twins while she was gone. It broke her heart to leave them, but this was her only chance to secure a future for them. She had no choice. The day she left, Jacob and Lily clung to her, their small arms wrapping around her waist as if they sensed how hard this was for her. "When will you be back, Mommy?" Jacob asked, his brown eyes wide with concern. "In a few weeks," Sarah replied, kneeling down to hug them tightly. "And when I come back, things are going to be better, I promise." Lily, always the quieter of the two, simply nodded and buried her face in Sarah's neck. The lump in Sarah's throat grew as she pulled away, kissing their foreheads before handing them off to Mrs. Reynolds. As she boarded the ship, the enormity of what she was doing began to sink in. This cruise was supposed to be her salvation, but as the massive ship loomed above her, a sense of dread filled her chest. She hadn't been away from the twins for this long since they were born, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. The cruise ship itself was a floating palace, gleaming white against the blue of the ocean. Guests in designer clothes strolled along the deck, laughing and sipping champagne, completely oblivious to the struggles of people like Sarah. She donned her uniform and took her place among the staff, her mind focused on the money she desperately needed to make. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. She worked long hours, her feet aching by the end of each shift, but it was a small price to pay for the money she was earning. She kept to herself, avoiding conversations with the other staff, her mind always on her kids, her debt, and the future she was trying to build. But then, on the fourth day, as she carried a tray of drinks to a table in the high-end restaurant, her world tilted on its axis. There, sitting at one of the tables, dressed in a sharp suit, was Michael. Sarah froze in place, her heart hammering in her chest as she stared at the man sitting at the table. For a moment, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. It couldn't be him. It just couldn't. Michael had died 7 years ago. He had left her alone to pick up the pieces, to raise their children, and to battle the mountain of debt that nearly swallowed her whole. But there he was, alive and more than alive. He looked polished. His hair was neatly styled, his suit crisp and expensive, and he sat with a casual confidence that made Sarah's stomach churn. And beside him was a woman, beautiful, with flowing dark hair and a smile that radiated warmth. She laughed softly at something Michael said, her hand resting gently on his. Sarah's grip tightened on the tray she was holding, her knuckles white. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. How could this be happening? Her knees felt weak, and for a moment she thought she might collapse right there in the middle of the restaurant. "Sarah, table 7. A voice snapped her out of her daze. One of the senior waitstaff gently nudging her toward another group of guests waiting for their drinks. With trembling hands, she managed to deliver the drinks, her thoughts spiraling. She couldn't confront him here. Not now. But how could she not? She needed answers. The man who had disappeared from her life, the man whose body had never been found, was sitting a few feet away from her, alive and well. What did that mean? Had he been hiding all this time? Why had he left her? As soon as her shift ended, Sarah hurried back to her small cabin. Her pulse raced, her hands shaking as she tried to process what she had just seen. Michael. He had been there, sitting like everything was normal, like he hadn't shattered her entire world. Her head swam with questions, none of them with answers. And yet, one thing became clear. She had to confront him. She had to know the truth. Later that evening, she paced the deck, waiting for the restaurant to close, rehearsing what she would say. But when the moment came, when she finally saw him leaving with that same woman on his arm, all her rehearsed words vanished. Instead, it was pure instinct that drove her feet forward, her heart pounding in her ears as she stepped into his path. "Michael?" Her voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. But it was enough. He stopped dead in his tracks, his body stiffening as he turned to face her. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something flickered in his expression. Recognition, maybe even guilt. But just as quickly, it was gone. He blinked, his face hardening into a mask of indifference. "Excuse me, do I know you?" he asked, his voice cool, detached. Sarah's blood ran cold. He was pretending. He was standing right in front of her, alive, and he was pretending he didn't even know her. Her jaw clenched as anger flared up inside her. 7 years of pain and confusion boiled to the surface, and she felt the weight of every single moment crash down on her. "You know who I am," she hissed, stepping closer, her eyes burning with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Don't you dare pretend like you don't." The woman beside him looked confused, glancing between them. "Michael? What is this? Who is she?" Michael let out a sigh, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Sarah. "You must be mistaken," he said flatly. "I don't know you. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have dinner reservations." He started to turn away, but Sarah wasn't going to let him slip through her fingers that easily. She grabbed his arm, yanking him back to face her. The woman beside him gasped, and Michael's eyes darkened, his calm facade slipping just for a moment. "How could you do this?" Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke. "How could you leave me? I thought you were dead. I had to raise our children alone. I had to face everything you left behind. And you've just been... what? Living this life with her?" Michael's jaw clenched, and for a second, Sarah thought she saw regret flash in his eyes. But then he pulled his arm free from her grip, his face hardening. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said coldly. "And if you don't leave us alone, I'll call security." Sarah stared at him, her heart breaking all over again. She wanted to scream, to cry, to shake him until he admitted the truth. But something in his voice, something in his posture told her that wasn't going to happen tonight. He wasn't going to admit anything. Not here. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she stepped back. The woman beside Michael clutched his arm, pulling him closer, as if to shield him from whatever chaos Sarah had brought into their evening. But Sarah wasn't done. Not by a long shot. "Fine," she said, her voice low but steady. "You can keep pretending all you want, but I know the truth, and I'm not going to let you get away with this." Michael's eyes locked onto hers for a long moment, tension thick between them. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, the woman on his arm. Sarah watched as they disappeared into the crowd, her chest tight with a mix of fury and devastation. She stood there, alone on the deck, the sound of the waves crashing against the ship echoing in her ears. The Michael she had once known, the man she had loved, the father of her children, was gone. In his place was a stranger, someone who had faked his own death and left her to pick up the pieces. But Sarah wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not this time. Not after everything he had put her through. She had come this far, survived this long, and she wasn't about to give up now. The next few days on the cruise passed in a blur. Sarah moved through her shifts like a ghost, her mind spinning with thoughts of Michael. Every time she replayed that moment on the deck, a mixture of fury and heartbreak coursed through her. How could he have left her? How could he have left their children, faked his own death, and built a new life with that woman? She didn't even know who she was angrier with, Him, for abandoning her and the twins, or herself, for still feeling that ache of longing, that hollowed-out space in her chest where the love for him used to be. Every day, she'd catch a glimpse of him on the ship, laughing with his new companion, living in a world that was so far removed from the life they'd once shared, and every time she saw him, it twisted the knife deeper. She needed answers. And soon. Late one night, when her shift finally ended, Sarah made up her mind. She couldn't wait any longer. She needed to confront him again, away from the prying eyes of guests, away from the woman who clung to his arm like he was the center of her universe. Sarah knew where he was staying. She had seen the suite assignments when she first started. And now, standing in the shadowed hallway outside his door, she felt her heart race with anticipation and dread. With a deep breath, she knocked. There was a long silence, and for a moment, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. Maybe he was asleep, or maybe he was ignoring her, hoping she'd just go away. But then, the door creaked open, and there he was. Michael stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. The same carefully constructed mask of indifference he had worn the night they'd first seen each other. "What do you want, Sarah?" His voice was flat, almost bored. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I want the truth, Michael. I deserve that much." He sighed and stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of what she was about to hear pressing down on her. But then she stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her. The suite was opulent, far removed from the cramped quarters where she stayed with the rest of the staff. The living area was large, with plush furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the ocean, the moonlight casting a silvery glow over the room. It was the kind of life Michael had always wanted: luxury, ease, no responsibilities weighing him down. He motioned for her to sit, but she remained standing, arms crossed, as if shielding herself from the emotional onslaught she knew was coming. Michael walked over to the window, staring out at the endless expanse of water. For a long moment, the only sound was the gentle hum of the ship's engines and the rhythmic crash of the waves. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and resigned. "I didn't plan it, you know." Sarah clenched her fists. "Didn't plan what? Leaving me, leaving your children, faking your death." He turned to face her, his expression softening just a fraction. "I didn't plan on it happening like this, but things got complicated." "Complicated?" Sarah's voice rose, her frustration bubbling over. "Michael, you disappeared. I thought you were dead. We had a funeral for you. I raised our children alone, thinking you were gone. And all this time, you were, what? Running away? Living this other life?" He flinched at her words, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I was in deep, Sarah. I owed more money than you could imagine. Those debts, they weren't going away. I didn't know how to handle it. So when the opportunity came, when that accident happened, I took it." Sarah felt like the ground was shifting beneath her. "You took it? You mean you saw an opportunity to disappear and you just left us?" He nodded, a deep sadness in his eyes that did nothing to soothe her anger. "Yes, I thought it was the only way. I thought, if I faked my death, I could get away from the debt, start over. And you didn't think about us?" Sarah's voice trembled. "You didn't think about how we'd survive? About your kids?" "I thought about it," Michael said, his voice cracking slightly. "I thought about it every day, but I didn't see a way out, Sarah. I was scared. I was in so deep, and the pressure was crushing me. So, I left." Sarah shook her head, unable to believe what she was hearing. "You left us to deal with the mess you created. Do you know what I've been through? What I've had to do to keep our children safe, to pay off the debts you left behind?" He dropped his gaze to the floor. "I know, and I'm sorry." "Sorry?" Sarah's laugh was bitter, full of years of pent-up pain. "That's all you have to say, "You're sorry." Michael ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "What do you want me to say, Sarah? I messed up. I made a mistake, but I can't change the past." She stared at him, her mind reeling. She had spent years imagining what this moment would be like, what she would say if she ever saw him again. But now that she was here, all she felt was an overwhelming sense of betrayal. "And what about her?" Sarah gestured toward the door, referring to the woman he'd been with. Was she part of the plan too? Michael hesitated, and that was all the answer Sarah needed. "I see," she whispered, her heart sinking. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," he said softly, but the words felt hollow. Sarah stood there, staring at the man she had once loved, the father of her children, and realized that the Michael she had known was gone. He had been replaced by someone she didn't recognize, someone who had made choices that shattered their lives. She took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "You may have escaped your debt, Michael, but you won't escape this. I'm not going to let you walk away from what you did." And with that, she turned and walked out of the suite, leaving Michael standing alone, his reflection lost in the glass. Back in her cramped cabin, Sarah sat on the edge of the small bed, her mind racing with the conversation that had just unfolded. The truth was out. Michael had left her and their children, faked his death, and now he was living a life of luxury with a woman who probably had no idea of the mess he had left behind. Her heart still pounded in her chest, her hands shaking from the confrontation. But now that the shock had worn off, something new began to take root. Determination. She had spent years struggling to survive, working herself to the bone for the twins, all while carrying the burden of Michael's betrayal. She had sacrificed everything. And yet, here he was, walking away from his responsibilities like none of it had ever happened. It wasn't fair, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. Michael had always been good at hiding his true self. He could charm anyone, make them believe he was someone worth trusting. But Sarah knew the truth now. And with the truth came power. She had something he didn't expect: knowledge. She knew what he had done, how he had abandoned them, and worse, he had done it to run from debt. Debt that was now crushing her and threatening the safety of her children. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a surge of control. She wasn't going to be the victim anymore. She wasn't going to let Michael's decisions dictate her life. It was time to fight back. The next morning, she wasted no time. Her first step was gathering as much information as she could. She started with the ship's guest records, easily accessible to staff members who needed to know the passengers' identities. There, in black and white, was Michael's new identity. He had changed his last name, adopted a new persona. But to Sarah, he was still the man who had destroyed everything. Next, she took a quiet moment in the staff break room to dig deeper into his companion. The woman, named Claudia, had booked the cruise as part of a lavish getaway. She and Michael were listed as husband and wife. It made Sarah sick to think of the life they had built on lies. Sarah knew she couldn't confront Michael head-on again, not without a plan. Her years of dealing with the Agiatas had taught her that survival wasn't just about strength, it was about strategy. She needed to be smart about this. If she went to the authorities, she'd need evidence. And if she went to the Agiatas, she'd need to make sure they didn't come after her or the twins. That night, after her shift, she made her way to the ship's communications center. She had one contact that could help her, an old acquaintance from her neighborhood who had worked in investigations for years. He wasn't exactly on the right side of the law, but that didn't matter to Sarah. She needed someone who could find dirt on Michael, and fast. She sent a discreet message, detailing what she had discovered about Michael, his new identity, and the life he had been living. She asked for any information that could link him back to his old debts, or even better, any evidence of illegal activities he had been involved in. It didn't take long for her contact to reply. A few hours later, Sarah received a response that made her blood run cold. Michael hadn't just been running from debt. He had been involved in a massive scam. one that had targeted a wealthy businessman back in their hometown. The plan had been simple: fake his death, disappear, and leave Sarah to deal with the fallout. He had cleaned out their accounts before disappearing, leaving her with nothing. But there was more. Her contact provided her with documents, bank transfers, fraudulent contracts, and even emails between Michael and his accomplices. The evidence was damning. If Sarah took this to the authorities, Michael wouldn't just be facing debt collectors. He'd be facing jail time. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the files, the weight of what she was holding sinking in. This was it. This was how she was going to get her life back. With these documents, she could not only clear herself of the debt, but she could also make sure Michael paid for everything he had done. But there was still the matter of the agiotas. Sarah knew that if she didn't handle things carefully, they could come after her once Michael was out of the picture. They had already proven how ruthless they could be, and she couldn't risk putting her children in more danger. She needed a way to involve them without becoming their next target. The answer came to her in a moment of clarity. If she turned Michael over to the agiotas before going to the authorities, she could use his debt to her advantage. She could negotiate her own safety in exchange for delivering Michael to them. After all, they didn't care who paid as long as they got their money. It was risky, but it was the only plan that made sense. She couldn't trust the authorities to handle this quickly enough. The agiotas had connections, and if anyone could track down Michael and make him face the consequences, it was them. With the evidence in hand, Sarah felt a new sense of purpose. She wasn't the same woman she had been 7 years ago, broken and afraid. She was stronger now, harder, and she wasn't going to let Michael destroy her life any longer. She made the call. The call was short and to the point. Sarah explained her situation to the agiotas, carefully crafting her words to make it clear that she wasn't their enemy. She wasn't running away. In fact, she was handing over something far more valuable than money. Michael had gotten away with his deceit for far too long, and it was time for him to face the consequences. The man on the other end of the line, someone she had only dealt with through intermediaries before, listened silently. His voice was low and cold, exactly as she'd expected, but when she mentioned Michael and the evidence she had, there was a pause. "Are you telling me you can give us the man who owes us millions?" he asked, his tone sharpening. "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the fear prickling at the back of her neck. "I have proof of where he is, the crimes he committed, and how he's been living under a new identity. I can give you everything you need to find him." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. She could almost hear the gears turning as he processed her offer. Sarah knew she was playing with fire, but this was her only option. If she didn't handle this perfectly, she could end up on the wrong side of their wrath. Or worse, they might turn their attention to her children. Finally, the man spoke again. "And what do you want in return?" "My safety," she said, her voice unwavering. "I've been paying off his debt for years. I want that debt erased. And I want to make sure that my children and I are left alone, once and for all. You get Michael and all the money he owes you, but I walk away clean. No more threats. No more visits." Another pause. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for his response, praying that this was the right move. She couldn't afford for this to go wrong. "All right," the man finally said, his voice colder than before. "But if you're lying, if this is some kind of trick, you'll regret it." "I'm not lying," Sarah said quickly, her voice firm. "I'll send you the documents tonight. You'll see for yourself that it's all real." He didn't say anything more before hanging up, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of what she had just set in motion. She stared at her phone, her hands trembling. It was done. She had made the call. Now there was no turning back. That night, she gathered all the evidence her contact had sent her, the bank records, the emails, the fraudulent contracts, and packaged them into a secure file. She sent everything to the agiotas, along with the details of Michael's whereabouts on the ship and his new identity. It was all there, undeniable and irrefutable. Once the message was sent, Sarah collapsed onto her bed, her body heavy with exhaustion. The weight of the past few days finally caught up with her, but there was a strange sense of relief in knowing that she had taken action. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't just surviving, she was fighting back. The next morning, Sarah went about her duties on the ship as usual, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. She tried to keep her head down, blending in with the other staff members, but every time she passed a group of security personnel or saw a guest she didn't recognize, her heart skipped a beat. The waiting was the hardest part. Hours passed, and still, nothing happened. Sarah began to wonder if the Agiotas had received her message, if they were planning something, or if she had miscalculated entirely. Doubt gnawed at the edges of her resolve, and she found herself checking her phone obsessively, waiting for some kind of sign that her plan had worked. Then, just after midday, she noticed something. There was a sudden flurry of activity near the main deck. Security guards were quietly moving through the crowd, and she spotted one of the senior officers heading toward the VIP suites, where Michael was staying. Her pulse quickened. This was it. Sarah followed at a distance, careful to stay out of sight. She watched as the security team reached Michael's suite and knocked on the door. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. Then, the door opened, and 2 guards stepped inside. She couldn't see Michael's face, but she imagined the shock, the panic that must have gripped him as they informed him that his time was up. Moments later, Michael emerged, flanked by the security officers. His expression was a mix of confusion and anger. But as they escorted him through the ship, Sarah saw the flash of recognition in his eyes. He knew. He knew this was her doing. He didn't struggle, didn't try to run. He simply walked with them, his head held high, as if he still had some semblance of control over the situation. But Sarah knew better. He was finished. His lies, his betrayal, they had all finally caught up with him. As they led him off the ship, Sarah stayed hidden, watching from a distance. Her breath caught in her throat as the reality of it all sank in. Michael was gone, and with him, the crushing weight of the past 7 years began to lift. The debt, the fear, the endless struggle to survive. It was over. She had done it. She had taken control of her life again. But even as a sense of relief washed over her, Sarah knew this wasn't the end. There were still pieces to pick up, still wounds to heal. And there was still the matter of Michael's accomplices, like Claudia, who had played their own roles in the deception. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of victory. The hardest part was behind her. And no matter what came next, Sarah knew she had the strength to face it. Sarah watched from the shadows as Michael was led off the ship. His head held high, but she could see the tightness in his jaw, the tension in his posture. He was trying to maintain control, to keep up appearances. But there was no escaping what was coming. She felt a strange mix of emotions watching him: relief, satisfaction, and even a small, bitter pang of sorrow for the man she had once loved. The man she thought she knew. But that man was gone. In his place was someone who had betrayed her, abandoned their children, and created a life of lies. As the security team escorted him toward a waiting car on the dock, Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before the Agiotas made their move. She had no illusions about what they would do once they had him. Michael had dug his own grave, and now he was going to lie in it. But there was still one loose end: Claudia. Sarah had seen her with Michael on the ship, laughing, carefree, completely unaware of the storm that was about to descend. Claudia wasn't just an innocent bystander. She had been a part of Michael's life for years, and Sarah suspected she knew more than she let on. There was no way Michael could have pulled off his disappearance without help, and Sarah was certain Claudia had played a role. After Michael was taken away, Sarah decided it was time for one last confrontation. She needed answers, needed to know just how deep Claudia's involvement went. The cruise wasn't over, and Claudia was still on board, blissfully ignorant of the chaos about to hit her. Sarah waited until later that evening, when most of the guests had retreated to their suites or were enjoying the late-night entertainment. The ship's corridors were quiet, the soft hum of the engines the only sound as Sarah made her way to Claudia's suite. Her hands trembled slightly, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. She had waited for this moment for years, and now it was finally here. She knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it swung open. Claudia stood there, dressed in an elegant silk robe, her face creasing in confusion as she recognized Sarah. "Can I help you?" Claudia asked, her voice smooth, polished, like she didn't have a care in the world. Sarah forced a smile. "We need to talk." Claudia glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone else was around, then turned back to Sarah with a small, condescending smirk. "About what, exactly?" "About Michael," Sarah said, stepping forward, her voice low and firm. "About what he's done, about what you've been a part of." Claudia's smirk faded, replaced by a slight narrowing of her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," Sarah snapped, her frustration bubbling over. "You've been with him for years. You've lived off the money he's stolen, the life he's built on lies. You know exactly what I'm talking about." Claudia's expression shifted, the mask of indifference slipping just slightly. "Look, whatever issues you have with Michael are between you two. I don't know anything about his past." "Liar," Sarah said, stepping closer, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You've known all along. You helped him disappear. You knew he left me, left his children, with nothing. You knew, and you didn't care." Claudia's eyes flickered with something, guilt, fear, or maybe just annoyance. She crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe, her tone sharp. "I didn't know the full story, all right? He told me you were out of the picture, that he had no choice but to leave. I didn't ask questions. We were happy." "Happy?" Sarah echoed, her voice rising in disbelief. "Happy? While I was struggling to feed our children? While I was being threatened, harassed, forced to pay off his debts?" Claudia's face paled slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "I didn't know it was that bad." "Didn't know or didn't care," Sarah shot back, her eyes blazing with fury. "You were too busy living in luxury to bother asking what happened to the life he left behind." Claudia flinched, her confidence wavering for the first time. She shifted on her feet, glancing around nervously, as if searching for an escape from the conversation. "Look, I'm sorry for what happened to you, but Michael made his own choices. I wasn't responsible for that." "You were complicit," Sarah said, her voice steady, the rage simmering just beneath the surface. "You helped him live a lie, and now he's paying the price for it. But don't think you're getting away with it either." Claudia's eyes widened in alarm. "What do you mean?" "I've given the authorities everything," Sarah continued, her tone cold and calculated. "All the evidence. Michael's debts, his fraud, and every single lie he told. They know about him. And they know about you. It's only a matter of time before they come for you too." Claudia's breath caught, her hands gripping the edge of the door as panic flashed across her face. "You can't be serious. I didn't do anything wrong." "You let him destroy my life," Sarah said, her voice shaking with the weight of years of betrayal. "And you stood by and watched while he did it. So yes, I'm serious. And trust me, you won't be able to hide behind Michael anymore." For a moment, Claudia was silent, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out of this nightmare. She looked at Sarah, and for the first time, there was no arrogance, no disdain, only fear. "You're making a mistake," Claudia whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "No, the only mistake I made was trusting Michael. But that's over now. And so is this." Without another word, Sarah turned and walked away, leaving Claudia standing alone in the doorway, her face pale and her body frozen in place. As Sarah made her way back to her cabin, the weight of everything she had done finally began to lift. Michael was gone, and soon, Claudia would be too. The past that had haunted her for years was finally coming to an end. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt free. The following morning, Sarah woke to the sounds of the ship's engines humming steadily beneath her cabin. The events of the previous night felt distant, like a dream, but the reality quickly set in. Michael had been taken off the ship. Claudia was likely in a state of panic, realizing that her comfortable life was about to unravel. And Sarah was finally free from the weight that had suffocated her for so many years. The tension that had gripped her for so long began to ease. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she breathed deeply, without fear gnawing at her insides. She had done it. She had taken control of her life, faced down the man who had left her broken, and handed him over to face justice. It wasn't the kind of closure she had imagined, but it was the closure she needed. As she prepared for the day, a soft knock on her door made her pause. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and her mind flashed to all the possible scenarios. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she wasn't afraid anymore. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. To her surprise, it wasn't a member of the crew or an Agiota enforcer. It was the ship's security officer, the same one she had seen escorting Michael off the ship. "Ms. Thompson?" he asked, his expression serious but not unkind. "Yes, that's me," Sarah replied, a touch of anxiety creeping into her voice despite her newfound strength. "I thought you'd like to know," the officer began, adjusting his cap. Well, the man you identified as Michael Thompson was taken into custody without incident. He's being transported to local authorities. And from what I understand, they'll be pursuing criminal charges. There's quite a lot of evidence stacked against him." Sarah nodded, her pulse quickening. "Thank you for letting me know. I wasn't sure what would happen after they took him off the ship." The officer gave her a small, knowing smile. "I've seen a lot of things in my time, but people like him, they never get away with it forever. It was only a matter of time. You did the right thing by coming forward." She didn't expect the wave of emotion that hit her at his words. It wasn't relief or even satisfaction. It was exhaustion. The kind that sets in after years of fighting, of holding it all together for so long. Her knees felt weak, and for a moment, she had to steady herself against the doorframe. The officer noticed. "Are you all right, Ms. Thompson?" Sarah nodded, forcing a smile. "I will be. It's been a long time coming." The officer tipped his hat, his expression softening. "I can imagine. Take care of yourself, all right? You've been through a lot." She thanked him, closing the door softly behind him. As she leaned against it, the enormity of it all settled over her like a heavy blanket. Michael was finally going to pay for what he had done, for abandoning her, for leaving her to shoulder the debt, for faking his death and living a life of lies. It was over, and yet, as the minutes passed, a strange emptiness lingered where her anger had once burned so fiercely. She had spent years fueled by the betrayal, by the need to protect her children and survive. Now, with that burden lifted, she didn't know what came next. After a few moments, Sarah made her way to the window of her small cabin and looked out at the vast ocean. The sunlight danced on the waves, the horizon stretching out infinitely before her. It was beautiful, peaceful even, but it was also a reminder that her journey wasn't over yet. She had fought so hard to survive, and now she needed to figure out how to live again. Her thoughts drifted to Jacob and Lily, the reason she had kept going all these years. They had been her light in the darkest of times, her reason to wake up each day and keep pushing forward, no matter how impossible it seemed. And now, she had the chance to give them the life they deserved, free from fear, free from debt, free from the ghosts of their father's betrayal. It was time to go home. As the ship docked in the bustling port city later that afternoon, Sarah gathered her few belongings and made her way to the gangway. The noise of the port was overwhelming. The shouts of dock workers, the rumble of trucks, the clatter of suitcases being unloaded. But for Sarah, it all faded into the background. Her focus was on getting back to her children. She had arranged for Mrs. Reynolds to pick her up at the port and take her back home. The thought of seeing her children again filled her with a warmth that she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, she was returning to them without the weight of fear and uncertainty hanging over her. As she stepped off the ship, she spotted Mrs. Reynolds' familiar old car idling near the curb. The elderly woman waved from the driver's seat, a smile spreading across her weathered face as Sarah approached. Sarah's heart swelled with gratitude. Mrs. Reynolds had been her rock during the darkest times, helping her care for the twins when things seemed impossible. "Welcome back, dear," Mrs. Reynolds said warmly as Sarah climbed into the passenger seat. "How was the trip?" Sarah paused for a moment, her gaze drifting out the window as the city whirred by. "It was complicated," she finally said, a small smile playing on her lips. "But it's over now. All of it." Mrs. Reynolds patted Sarah's hand gently. "I'm glad to hear it. The twins are going to be so happy to see you. They've been talking about you nonstop since you left." A lump formed in Sarah's throat at the thought of her children. "I've missed them so much." The rest of the drive passed in comfortable silence, and soon they arrived at the small apartment building Sarah called home. As she stepped out of the car, her heart raced with anticipation. Jacob and Lily would be waiting for her inside, their faces lighting up when they saw her. She couldn't wait to hold them, to tell them that everything was going to be all right. For the first time in 7 years, she could finally believe it. Sarah stepped out of the car and made her way toward the apartment building, the familiar brick facade a welcome sight. Her heart raced as she climbed the stairs, her mind filled with thoughts of Jacob and Lily. 7 years of struggle, of sleepless nights and endless worry, had led to this moment. She was coming home, really coming home this time, with the knowledge that the past no longer had a grip on her. As she reached the door to her apartment, she could already hear the faint sound of giggles coming from inside. She smiled, her hand hovering over the doorknob for a moment, savoring the anticipation. Then, with a deep breath, she opened the door. The sight that greeted her made her heart swell. Jacob and Lily were sitting on the floor with Mrs. Reynolds, surrounded by a jumble of toys and coloring books. The twins looked up in unison, their eyes lighting up with excitement the moment they saw her. "Mommy!" Jacob shouted, jumping to his feet and running toward her. Lily wasn't far behind, her face glowing with joy. Sarah dropped to her knees, arms wide open as the twins barreled into her, nearly knocking her over with the force of their hugs. She wrapped her arms around them, pulling them close, her heart aching with a mixture of happiness and relief. For so long, she had dreamed of this moment, of holding them without the weight of fear pressing down on her. "I missed you both so much," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she kissed the top of their heads. "We missed you too, Mommy," Lily chimed in, her small hands clutching Sarah's shirt tightly, as if afraid she might disappear again. Mrs. Reynolds stood up slowly, stretching her stiff back before giving Sarah a warm smile. "They've been asking about you every day. They'll be happy to hear you're back for good now." Sarah nodded, still holding on to her children. "Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds. I don't know what I would have done without you." The older woman waved her hand dismissively, though her eyes gleamed with affection. "Nonsense. I'm just glad you're all right. That's what matters." Sarah smiled, but there was a weight to her expression that Mrs. Reynolds seemed to notice. The older woman walked over and patted Sarah's shoulder gently. "Well, I'll leave you to your reunion. You've earned some time with these little ones." With that, Mrs. Reynolds gathered her things and made her way toward the door, pausing only once to give Sarah a final nod of encouragement. "You're a strong woman, Sarah. Stronger than most. Don't ever forget that." As the door closed behind her, Sarah sat back on the floor with Jacob and Lily, letting herself get lost in the sound of their laughter and the warmth of their hugs. For the first time in years, she felt like she could finally breathe, like the crushing weight that had been sitting on her chest was lifting. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, playing with toys, coloring, and sharing stories. Sarah watched her children with a kind of wonder. realizing just how much she had missed during the years she had spent struggling to keep them afloat. She had been so consumed by survival, by the debt and the fear, that she had missed out on these little moments, the moments that really mattered. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the evening sky turned shades of pink and orange, Sarah tucked Jacob and Lily into bed. They were both exhausted, their eyes drooping as she read them their favorite bedtime story. Lily curled up under her blanket, clutching her stuffed bunny, while Jacob lay beside her, his eyes barely open as he listened to his mother's soothing voice. "Are you really staying home this time, Mommy?" Jacob asked sleepily, his small voice cutting through the quiet. Sarah's heart ached at the question. She leaned down and kissed his forehead gently. "Yes, sweetie. I'm home for good. No more leaving." "Good," Jacob murmured, his eyes fluttering shut as he drifted off to sleep. Lily was already asleep, her soft snores filling the room. Sarah sat there for a moment, watching her children, her heart swelling with love and a deep sense of peace. They were safe. They were finally safe. As she quietly slipped out of the room and closed the door behind her, Sarah walked into the living room and sank into the worn couch. The apartment was small and modest, but it was home. It was theirs. And for the first time in years, Sarah didn't feel like a prisoner in her own life. She was free to start over, free to build a new future for herself and her children. But the weight of the past still lingered at the edges of her mind. Michael was gone, but the memories of his betrayal, the years of struggle, weren't something she could just forget. She had survived, yes, but now she had to figure out how to live again, how to rebuild her life without the constant fear of what was lurking around the corner. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The scars ran deep, and there were still days ahead that would be difficult. But as she sat there, surrounded by the quiet hum of the apartment, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She didn't have all the answers yet, but for now, that was enough. In the days that followed, Sarah settled into a new rhythm. Life was still far from easy. There were bills to pay, groceries to buy, and the ever-present task of raising two energetic 7-year-olds on her own. But it felt different now. Lighter, somehow. There was no longer the constant shadow of Michael's betrayal hanging over her. No debt collectors knocking at her door. No fear that everything would crumble around her at any moment. For the first time, she could make decisions about her future and her children's, without the weight of the past pressing down on her. One evening, as she sat at the small kitchen table, Sarah found herself thinking about everything that had led her to this point. Michael's arrest had made the news, his crimes exposed for the world to see. He would face years in prison, maybe even a lifetime, depending on the full scope of his financial fraud. And Claudia? Sarah wasn't sure where she had ended up, but it didn't matter anymore. She had done her part. As she sipped her tea, a quiet sense of closure settled over her. The man who had caused her so much pain was no longer a part of her life. It was time to let go, to truly start fresh. The next day, Sarah woke up early, the sunlight streaming through the curtains as the sounds of the city outside began to filter in. She could hear Jacob and Lily giggling in their room, and the sound brought a smile to her face. These moments, these simple, beautiful moments, were what mattered now. She had spent so many years just trying to survive that she had forgotten how to live. But now, she had the chance to build something better for herself and her children, and she wasn't going to waste it. After breakfast, Sarah took the twins out for a walk to the nearby park. It was a bright, warm day, and the park was filled with families, couples, and children running through the grass. Jacob and Lily darted off toward the swings, their laughter ringing through the air as they played. Sarah watched them, her heart swelling with a quiet, steady joy. She sat on a bench, letting the peacefulness of the scene wash over her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was constantly waiting for the next disaster. She didn't feel like she was always on the edge, ready for something to go wrong. There was no fear here, just the sound of her children laughing and the feeling of the sun warming her skin. As she watched them, she thought about all the lessons she had learned over the past 7 years. She had learned that strength wasn't just about surviving. It was about finding a way to keep going, even when everything felt impossible. It was about fighting for what mattered, about protecting the people you loved, even when you didn't have all the answers. And she had learned that sometimes letting go was the hardest but most important thing to do. Michael had been a part of her life for so long, first as the man she had loved, then as the man who had betrayed her, and finally as the man she had defeated. But now he was gone, and she was free. Free to build a new future, one that didn't involve the ghosts of her past. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself thinking less and less about what had happened with Michael, and more about the life ahead of her. There was so much possibility now, so much to look forward to. She wasn't sure where life would take her next, but for the first time in a long time, she was excited to find out. Later that evening, after tucking Jacob and Lily into bed, Sarah stood by the window of her small apartment and gazed out at the city. The lights twinkled in the distance, cars honking softly as the city buzzed with life. It was peaceful in its own way, a reminder that the world kept turning, no matter what had happened in the past. A sense of calm settled over her as she stood there, watching the city. For years, she had been waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the past to catch up with her, waiting for something to go wrong. But now, there was nothing left to wait for. The past was behind her, and the future was hers to shape. As she turned away from the window and prepared for bed, a soft smile played on her lips. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was hers. And that, more than anything, was what mattered. For the first time in years, Sarah fell asleep without the weight of worry pressing down on her chest. She had won her freedom, not just from Michael, but from the fear and doubt that had held her back for so long. Now, she could finally live. And for Sarah, that was the greatest victory of all.